The Maqasid approach is closely linked with the concept of maslahah, which is equivalent to benefit or human good, since one needs to have a thorough understanding of human good to evaluate and act using the objectives of Sharia. Now, of course, there's a margin, there's a degree of interpretation within the new context, as Dr. Ildus was discussing. But again, because that's relatively more limited, because the scriptures, the sources are the same, and of course we can come up with creative understandings of the scriptures. But what is more at stake here is how we define and understand human good, and especially with respect to my talk yesterday, where we were saying that usually in the pre-modern times, this good was mostly based on some higher metaphysical some higher metaphysics, which is now primarily lacking in our contemporary times, and it becomes more relative, more fluid. And if we make it into a criterion to decide something which is ethical or appropriate, then we need to invest a good amount of critical thinking to see what a human good is. And as we'll see in a while, that the way Dr. Ildus was referring to things and discussing things, it actually came up that this Maqasid approach actually allows us to move beyond the specifics and see what one might say the synergistic effects or the things that are happening in totality together. And where do we use this approach? Of course, for the cases where no direct textual reference from the Quran or the Sunnah is available to sanction the desirability or undesirability of the situation, it should be judged by evaluating the human good, maslahah, and harm, mafsada. So again, things that are clear-cut, that have stayed more or less the same, and we have the precedents in the scriptures and other legal precedents. There's not much need for this, and especially in a case of modern technology, that's a new thing, a novel thing. We need to use this. Individual and collective good, because again, this is of central importance, that when we are talking of maslahah, this from an Islamic vantage point, this concept of maslahah considers, although it considers both individual and societal welfare in all their possible dimensions, but here tazkiyah or self-purification of the individuals and communities, this is the most essential and highest objective of Islamic commands and prohibitions. And everything else acts as, although when we talk about maqasid, we talk about the 5 maqasid that is of religion, life, property, or wealth and honor and intellect. But if we closely look at that, everything else, such as wealth or intellect, it allows you, for instance, the intellect allows you to think about the meaning and the purpose of life and then act accordingly. Wealth allows you to sustain your life for your sustenance. So at the end of the day, all are converging towards this, the sole purpose of tazkiyah or self-purification of the individuals and communities. Now, in this scheme, the collective good is given priority over the individual good, with the prevention of collective harm given higher priority over both the prevention of individual harm and acquisition of collective good. And why is this so? This is not only because of the utility, because if we, for instance, let me give you a quick example. Let's say there's a person who has to go for tertiary care in medicine, and that costs, let's say, 1 million rupees, versus there are 100 people who need primary health care, right? And that costs the same amount of money. It's not just the utility, that of course the number of people is more on the other side, and the happiness enjoyed or the harm removed would be greater. But actually what's what's a greater need of the community, right? So this might sound to be utilitarian, but it's basically the rationale behind this preference of communal well-being over individual well-being is that the idea that community has a precedence over an individual. Some of the individual good might actually have to be sacrificed to make that communal well-being possible. And the other important thing that we find here is that the prevention of individual harm has a priority over acquisition of good. And why is this the case? And this has actually become more apparent in our discussions since yesterday, that there's more consensus of humanity on the real and possible harms, dangers, and threats of technology, specifically AI, than the good that might come. That's more uncertain, that's more probable, versus the harm that's already caused. There's a higher degree of certainty to that, right? And that's what we find here as well, that the prevention of collective harm has a higher priority over the prevention of both individual harm and the acquisition of collective good. So that actually makes a lot of evaluation easier when it comes to looking at AI on the whole, and also looking at specific applications. Because again, harm, if it's known, it's there, it's known, and if you know that you can prevent it, you can prevent it. Whereas when we are talking about the positive side, the good, it's relatively vague, right? And there are many possibilities and many potentialities of how it can actually be enacted, especially in future, right? So for instance, an example that I often give is, for instance, 100 years back, or even 50 years back, when plastics were being made, right? We even see the movies of those times where it's like sort of flaunted of how, plastic has made life easy and convenient. But only 50 years down the line, everyone's saying that it's perhaps one of the greatest evil of our times, right? So now this is the problem with the consequentialist way of judging or evaluating the goodness or badness of something. Because if I ask you, I mean, let's say it could be like even a very simple thing. If I ask you, आप जो ये let's say कोई processed cheese खा रहे हैं, right? इसका क्या फायदा और क्या नुकसान है, right? Now, how would you evaluate, right? कि processed food जो है, अब कहते अभी खाया, अभी तो कुछ भी नहीं है. It's like it causes me, it has a good taste and it helps me, whatever, fulfill my need. I was hungry and I ate something. But now, how can you evaluate the consequences of the production of that one can of processed food for, let's say, the livelihood of people that's being replaced by that manufacturing industry? And we know that a lot of diseases, we don't directly immediately identify them. A lot of times those correlations takes time to be established, established with a degree of certainty. Now, and this could like go on, and something can have an effect, have a more far-reaching effect, say 50 years or 100 years down the line. So that's the problem with consequentialism, if we take that as a criterion for ethics. And when it comes to harm, especially harm that's known, there's a consensus that's built over that, then it's easier to prevent that. Philosophically and culturally too, knowing what is harmful and having a consensus over it across culture is easier than developing a vision for what could cause human good in future. In case of technologies which have indefinite potential, and enumerating their beneficial future consequences is much more difficult and arbitrary. And I'll talk about that. There's a thinker, her name is Alor, and she talks about techno-moral values and techno-moral wisdom, and she uses a term which is techno-opacity. She says that it's opaque, right? we cannot really look into the future very clearly, visibly, as to how things are going to turn out. If you look at the current critical stance toward the ill effects of various late modern technologies, including AI, there are shared sentiments regarding the harms caused and the potential for future harms. I mean, there's more consensus over that than the benefits. When evaluating the human good and harm, both individual and social contexts are considered in the light of customs and known practices in any given situation. Now, this again, this importance of context has been highlighted time and again since yesterday, and this is something that's really important, and that actually allows room for, let's say, the plurality that was being talked about yesterday, right? So again, if it's something that only pertains to the individual, it's relatively easier, and we know that it has always been the practice of the Muslim jurists, the fuqaha, who would look at the idiosyncratic, the individual situation, position, and then decide accordingly. And when it comes to the collective harm and the collective good, we also need to take the social context into consideration. For instance, what I just said to Dr. Ildus actually is representative of that, right? So let's say if somebody says that, 15 centuries back, Abdurrahman bin Auf radiallahu anhu, he had a wardrobe of, let's say, 200 outfits. And then sort of justifies their wardrobe of brands that are known to be highly unethical and involved in highly unethical practices. Do you think this would be a right borrowing of that historical precedent? Right. So this is what I mean by social context, right? That a lot of things, when these problems were not there or are not there in any society, we see things differently. But when we see those burning issues, right, then we have to look at them, of course, holistically. The usul or the principles is that providing a layout of what in a given historical period would constitute meaningful life on individual and communal scales. And this is actually the philosophical task, right? And again, this would involve, because although the goal or the purpose in Islam to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, stays the same. But how that is converted into individual and communal meaningful lives, of course, varies across time and space. So for instance, if we look at our contemporary situation, we know there's a crisis, this food insecurity. There's a lot of discussion on growing organic food that's close to home, right? Now, in this context, for a Muslim family or a Muslim community to live a meaningful life whereby you are connected to nature, perhaps gets a higher priority than, say, what was 300 or 400 years ago, or even 100 years ago, right? So it depends on what other discourses are currently there in the existing sphere, and then looking at what would amount to be living a really purposeful and meaningful life within that context. So again, this actually requires a very systemic approach to almost everything, every significant thing that contributes to human well-being. And then critically evaluate the various practices and institutions through that criterion to see the synergistic effects of those devices and practices for human life, both present and future. Now, while reflecting or pondering over these things in the course of our research, of course, what came out is what Dr. Ildus was also referring to, that, this is the status quo, this is the situation, right? And we have to somehow, address that. So again, when we were doing this work, we were thinking of developing something, of course, that's not impractical, but at the same time, that does not accept the status quo either, right? So it would actually recommend that there needs to be structural changes that need to be made in order to make this methodology and this approach really workable, right? And we know that this happens, let's say, if we have a scientific hypothesis, there are lots of auxiliary assumptions. And if you leave that, you are not able to establish your hypothesis, right? So likewise, what we are claiming here using this approach is precisely this, right? That we cannot say that everything else stays the same and we just fix this problem. This is actually a very reduction, and this is actually what is happening in those other approaches, and that shows, you know, which shows the failure or the lack of those approaches, and that's what we are trying to address. So there's one thing to think up of something that's in principle applicable, and it's another thing that we don't have the political will to actually do that, right? So that shouldn't stop us, and that shouldn't make our stance amenable to those sort of ethical compromises, which are, and we should have a principled stance in that. So in a utilitarian calculus, jurists weigh benefits and harms in deciding the permissibility or impermissibility of something. So the moral legal constructs of maslahah and darura and istirar are invoked, and Dr. Asim did talk about those things at length yesterday. In the proposed methodology, we are saying that the essence, limits, and reality of human beings in human life have to be taken into consideration, and how technology shaped the conceptualization of human subjectivity is opened up for inquiry. Now, because where you just weigh the benefits and harms of something that has come to dominate the social lives, is one thing. And if you remember Dr. Asim's slide yesterday, that was at the end of the trajectory. So initially you have to look at, so for instance, if we are talking about, let's say there was a student yesterday who was discussing with me one of his research areas in which he's trying to build a correlation between how what is happening, let's say on Twitter or on these platforms is translated into real life violent scenarios. Now, there's this idea that the cyber selves are sort of correspond with the real selves in the real world is a big assumption, right? Now, how does that self is being created? Why are people more happy communicating, expressing their selfhood via these technological platforms, right? Rather than engaging in, embodied experience, right? So there's this whole new creation of human subjectivity that is taking place here, right? And if we sort of take that as a given and start from here, then we are missing out on the very basic ontological question, okay, what kind of humans we are and what kinds of humans we want to shape, right? So this approach allows for such deeper reflections and inquiries. The other thing is the preference of wisdom, hikma over illah in evaluating AI and anything for that matter, because we found this in Imam Shatibi's thought as well. He has talked about it. Now, illah again has, you have this, you have a precedent, and then you have a new case, and then you try to find an illah that unifies the two so that you can have the same hukum, the hukum that was there for the old case, you can apply to the new case, right? This is how fiqh works. Lekin illah mein hota kya hai ki we are looking at a specific case, right? Now, the way we have been discussing AI, right? We are saying that it doesn't, most of the time, it doesn't have an effect on just one area of life, right? So let's say if you're using AI in court trials, right? To, let's say, ease off the burden on the legal system, right? So aksar logon ko, trials may takes years on end to settle a case, and we use that. Now, it's on the one hand, it might actually make it relatively quicker, but on the other hand, we'll have to, through this system, we will see that what does the justice system, what it is meant to do, right? And thinking it through within the Islamic parameters. So we know that absolute justice, 100% justice, is never going to be possible in this world, right? With all the human limitations, right? But we are supposed to try our best, right? That's our ideal. And in that process, what is important is the kind of effort that not only the people in the court, like the judges and the jury, but as a community, how we are able to morally uplift ourselves while working towards that ideal justice, right? And in that case, what there's a trade-off, right? So in order to have a convenient, fast system, we are allowing ourselves to take a step back from there, right? And let it happen. It will be quick, it will be fast. It might actually not even be unjust, right? There's this reservation, there's this concern that it might end up, criminalizing people who aren't. But even for the sake of argument, if we assume that this is not happening, even then, is it desirable then? And the question that arises that we kept on thinking is that then what do we think we humans are supposed to do in our lives other than some very routine affairs that we do every day? So whenever something that's controversial happens, there's a time for us to actually reflect and see what role we are playing in addressing whatever oppression or injustice wherever it is happening. So if these artificial machines take care of that, then of course we are, I'm not saying right or wrong, but of course we are thinking along a new conceptualization of being human. So that needs to be seen and discussed. And for instance, this approach allows for values like adl and qist to be the guiding norms, right? In deciding upon, so sort of I'm contrasting illah with hikma, and hikma is associated with adl and qist. So the cultivation of adl, although they're pretty much synonymous, adl and qist both have to do with justice, but adl looks more inwardly towards, the balance within the individual, and which includes both the designers and users, while the prevalence of qist is about not rupturing it through the AI devices, such as, it shouldn't be, fueling racism, etc. The general concerns that people have for AI. But qist is not the only thing. If you look globally, then the sole concern of people is qist. So there shouldn't be, you shouldn't be over criminalizing someone based on gender or race, etc. I mean, that's a concern. The cultivation of balance within the individuals, so that they are able to meet the requirements of justice. That is also important, because this is what makes us human. We can think about justice, and we can think about injustice. For instance, Dr. Suri was yesterday saying that these are the things that are intangible. And it's only by virtue of being humans that we have this intuitive sense of right, wrong, just, unjust, and so on. So if we divest ourselves of that, then again, we are sort of rethinking our humanness, and it would be something else. We are not saying whether we approve of it or not, but it would definitely not what for instance, Dr. Ildes was talking about, being humans. And yes, qist, of course, should stand here for social, environmental, and economic justice, because the prevalent paradigm. Now, I have even read up on articles that say that, for instance, there would come a time when almost all the jobs done by humans would be taken over by machines. And then what should happen? So now they are talking about the fact that people should be given the stipend. There should be a mechanism for them. Now, the question is not just the fact that they would not be able to earn, and there should be some alternative system for them to earn. The idea is that during these 2 years of COVID, when everybody was home and they were still earning, they didn't lose their jobs. What was it that people were missing out on? Right? They were still working, they were still delivering whatever their tasks, But this idea of working and growing together, every day you get to meet a lot of people who don't match your taste, and then you have to exercise a lot of tolerance, a lot of patience, a lot of sympathy, a lot of empathy, a lot of compassion. Now, how tradable these things are, and if they form a part of our essence as humans, right? So I'll talk more about it when we talk about virtue ethics and the Islamic virtue ethics. So likewise, when we talk about these things, there's this social dimension, there's this environmental dimensions, and it's not only for AI. I just don't understand कि AI में अचानक से लोगों को इतना ख्याल आ गया environment का कि data centers जो है ना वो इतने terabytes और इतने जो है ना energy consumption है, लेकिन उससे पहले जो infrastructure था, let's say internet का, even prior to the smartphones, that was also pretty much energy intensive. उसका भी consumption बहुत ज़्यादा था. Computers तो उस वक्त भी बन रहे थे, उस वक्त भी landfills में जा रहे थे, right? So again, also we shouldn't just jump on board कि पूरी दुनिया चूँकि AI ethics के ऊपर इस वक्त बस बात करिए, तो somehow we feel that it is imperative on us to do that as well. But then again, of course, I'm not saying that the problems aren't there, but we need to sort of distance ourselves from the predominant discourse and try to evaluate things from our own unique perspective. And then, of course, economic injustice that is being predicted. This is, again, something that we have already heard Dr. Auda talking about, that this method evaluates the applications by placing them within the complex web of meaning and value, since one application does not positively or negatively affect only one value. So for instance, the environmental costs of manufacturing and maintaining AI equipment for healthcare could be far more than personalized care not involving AI. What would you choose? Right? अगर let's say एक trade off करना पड़े और हमें ये पता है कि जी इस equipment को मैन्युफैक्चर करने से लेकर के मेंटेन करने से लेकर के उसको ट्रैश में जाने तक जो है उसका कितना environmental impact है, as against के we have that traditional model of people caring for people, right? It's especially I have in mind robot nurses and so on. तो उस तरह की अगर चीजें so what, or even the very idea that can we have a trade-off like that when it comes to things like that, right? So this again allows us to think more expansively. And then it's a systemic evaluation of complex, interdependent, character making or destabilizing resources inherent in these applications collectively. Now, I think the key thing here is character making or destabilizing resources, because this is one thing that is conspicuously missing from the global narrative, right? Because again, as we discussed yesterday, that within the parameters of ethical thinking, it doesn't allow that approach to actually think about character making and what constitutes this instability. And it's actually, again, ironical, because when the mental health issues spike, it becomes a source of concern for everyone. But then this is kind of irreconcilable with the very fact when we say that individuals are free to make themselves into whatever they want to. And if that is the case, and that should be the case, then we should embrace, if all of them want to do a collective suicide, that's just an expression of how they want themselves to be, how they want to express them. But then sort of our fitra intervenes, right? And even the advocates of that sort of freedom and autonomy, even they become uncomfortable, and suddenly mental health becomes our highest priority, and so on and so forth. So again, this is something primary in the Islamic Maqasidic approach. So when we question the assumptions, right? So these are two quotes, and they are both from the Montreal Declaration on AI ethics. And they had this resolution back in 2018, and it's a very new field. AI ethics is just a matter of last 3 or 4 years when you see lots of such ethical manuals popping up. If I ask you people to read these two quotes, what do you see here that's implicit, that's sort of just considered to be there, and which is not critically opened up for discussion? For instance, in the first quote, it says that artificial intelligence constitutes a major form of scientific and technological progress, which can generate considerable social benefits by improving living conditions and health, facilitating justice, creating wealth, right? A major form of scientific and technological progress. This is the premise, this is the assumption, and this is considered to be just, it's there. It's just like, gospel truth that you cannot question. And if we begin from here, then of course, we cannot move very farther from here, right? So this is something, such implicit assumptions have to be questioned, have to be unpacked, not necessarily refuted all the time, but at least see that where they are coming from. And back to our central question of how we actually define the good. And then the second quote, it says that intelligent machines are not limited to performing better calculations than human beings. They can also interact with sentient beings, keep them company, and take care of them. Now, again, this idea of what does it mean to have company, and we see how our understanding of these things evolve and get transformed over time, right? So again, this embodied presence of being with someone and having a virtual Zoom meeting, how these things become norm, and then they redefine for us what we mean when we say that we want to have a meeting with someone, right? So on and so forth. So again, interaction, taking care of them, caring, what does it mean, right? So because we are assuming that they have the ability to take care, right? And then even if we say that they don't feel, and that's fine, but they can still take care of your bodily needs. But at the same time, when some human cares for someone, even for some physical care, what else does it involve, right? So Dr. Ildes was, for instance, talking about our human constitution as spiritual, emotional beings having qalb and so on and so forth. Again, the question is of perfecting AI or perfecting the human character. So the use of AI applications in preference to human actors, in addition to increased efficiency, was its purported neutrality and objectivity, which was supposed to eliminate such prejudices. Various reported incidents of bias in AI-based systems and the unfair outcomes it can lead to have shown us that AI models are not neutral, objective, and cannot be assumed to be intrinsically fair, as they only reflect the views of the one who builds them and the data they are fed. Now, the idea is that everyone is talking about this, that we should work more on those systems to become rigorous, to become error-free, right? We are acknowledging that they are not the best models so far. They have this inherent biases, and these biases are, of course, representative of the people who are designing it. Either they're deliberately doing it or they are not careful enough to why do we want the machines to be ever more error-free, right? So what is more important for us? So again, if it's representing human biases, then shouldn't our focus be more on how to make human beings, how to remove their biases, how in what ways we can raise human beings, what in learning and the growing up environment we can provide them so that they don't have the biases. Once we are able to if not totally remove, but decrease the amount of biases that we harbor within us, of course, that would be translated into machines, and even if they aren't translated into machines, so what's the focus, right? So often at times when you're saying that, no, we need to be more rigorous while designing it, we sort of mix up as to whether we want more perfect machines or we want more perfect human beings, or perfecting the human character. Yeah, so these are the examples that we have already seen. The other thing is, for instance, these values. Now, how many of you think that these values like ease and convenience, from an Islamic perspective, how many of you think that they are instrumental or procedural? I mean, that is leading to something else, that they are not sought for themselves, but they actually make the attainment of something else possible? कितने लोगों का ख्याल है कि ease और convenience जो है वो हमारा goal है as Muslims, या Islam का एक objective है to make life easy just for its own sake? ह्यूमैनिटी को ईज दें बस इसलिए कि वो बस बहुत ही कन्वीनियंट तरीके से जिंदगी गुजारे और अपने उस ईज को वो मल्टीप्लाई करती रहे और ऑगमेंट करती रहे एंडलेसली. राइट, मतलब ईज तो फिर ये है ना कि नमाज पढ़ने में भी मुश्किल होती है, रोजा रखना तो बहुत ही मुश्किल काम होता है, हज तो फिर वही बात है कि कोई जाएगी हमारी तरफ से करके आ जाएगी मशीन, आसानी, हमारा मकसद तो आसानी है. तो I mean that's not the case, right? Ease is actually a value, but it's instrumental, or what we might call procedural value, that allows for substantive or intrinsic values to actually take place. जबकि हमने ये देखा भी पिछली वाली स्लाइड में भी कि जो AI के बारे में जितनी भी बात हो रही है, it revolves around ease and convenience, right? As where convenience is taken as the substantive, the final end or the final goal, right? अभी हम थोड़ी सी मशक्क़ा के ऊपर भी बात करते हैं, और फिर control भी है, as in the Internet of Things. We want to have a control over everything, right? मुझे लोग कहते हैं आपके पास स्मार्ट पंखा होगा और आप जो ना आएंगे वो सेंस कर लेगा और वो जो ना उसके हिसाब से रेगुलेट हो जाएगा. मैं तो अपने बच्चों को ही सिखाती हूँ, हर दफा उन्हें 4 दफा भेजती हूँ कि जाओ जाके पंखे बंद करो, to make them more conscious of what they are using and not using and the number of blessings that they are enjoying. तो वो तो फिर सारा कुछ खुद ही हो जाएगा, वो तो अभी बहुत काहिल हो गए हैं, वो तो और भी ज्यादा हो जाएंगे, right? And then the instilling of value, so we don't make our kids or ourselves do these things just for the sake of doing it. Actually, there's some value framework that is informing our decisions to do those things. So again, Internet of Things का बहुत ज़्यादा आजकल है, तो so the control element, right? Now, theologically speaking, how, I mean, and as I said in the beginning, that I'm only problematizing these things because I don't have a really strong grip on the various streams in Islamic theology. But of course, what is our understanding of control, and how much control should we wield, should we have, should we aspire towards, so on and so forth. And then of course, this idea that if we want to make everything very easy and very convenient, then what does this all have to do with ourselves, with our essence as human beings, right? Things like experiencing losses, bearing pain and suffering, having time alone for introspection. Because a lot of people, my own kids in the family say, taklif, it's very hard. Don't ask us to just be alone and do nothing, right? We just want, some sort of stimulation is always, it should be there, right? So they are all part of human condition that aid us in moral development, growth, and character building, right? Because at the end of the day, what makes a hero a hero? There's some situation that requires some sort of sacrifice, sort of transcending above your own selfishness and your interests and so on and so forth, right? And the very idea of nawafil, or supererogatory worship, in Islam, right? Which is, again, that's not fard, that not doing it wouldn't make you sinful. But what's the hikmah behind that, right? That you willfully try to, and then the famous hadith in which the Prophet said that, it's khair, everything is khair, right? So if you are exercising patience and sabr, it's still khair for you. So again, because many a times when we sort of unthinkingly take those manuals. I'm not saying that we don't have those common grounds. I've actually been emphasizing that throughout the conference, but still that sort of, because the idea of how we define khair, how we define human good, which is primarily more of our reaction than what the situation poses, right? So somebody could be extremely wealthy, and that could be, a great trial for that person, right? So again, this whole idea that these things can actually have a positive impact on us, that needs to be taken into consideration. And then this I would call the ontological question, right? That what is valuable and what can be deputed to intelligent machines begs the question of what shall be the standard for making this value judgment. And then again, these are the things that you wouldn't find directly in the scriptures, in the Quran and Sunnah, but at the same time, there are many references. So if we approach those scriptures with our context and our questions and our dilemmas, then we find the text to be speaking to us on these matters, right? And this is what, for instance, the Maqasid Institute is also emphasizing. And there's also this idea of thematic understanding and thematic analysis of the Quran. I use that approach a bit in my work as well. So again, that's axiology is, the question of values, right? So we are usually in the general narrative, we are usually stuck at axiology, right? The question of values. But this is not merely an axiological question, but it is also an ontological question as to what kind of new human subjects we need to have in a post-enlightenment digital age. एक तो वो हैं जो बन गए, but they are not of our own making, right? ये जो digital selves जिनकी हम बात कर रहे थे, it just happened, right? So we import everything. So we imported, that as well. Now it's there, but now when we are deliberating as to what kind of humans should we want to produce, so again, the challenges 200 years back were different, and we wouldn't want everyone to be, very to be always soul searching, etc., right? A lot of those dilemmas were resolved at the community level, and everyone didn't have to go into those deep reflections, right? But that's now different altogether, right? Some very basic choices need a lot of moral reflection, because you will face a lot of consequences by having or not having someone, right? Something, or that has become the norm. So again, the kind of new human subjects that we need to have in a post-enlightenment digital age, and this again needs to be reflected from within the precinct of Islamic theology. And this new concept of human should include a rationality that transcends the limitations of the instrumentalist rationality, right? Jaise ki abhi hum generally, if you talk to anyone, and they would say that, look, it's easy, because it allows you to reach out to people, again, ease and convenience and efficiency. These are all instrumental values, right? Even efficiency. You don't aim for efficiency for the sake of efficiency itself, right? You need efficient car so that it can take you where you want to go, right? You don't want an efficient car just because it is efficient, right? So again, that's something that we need to think on. Now, virtue ethics, because although it's not something new, right? Virtue ethics has been there since thousands of years, but there's a revival of interest in virtue ethics. And that very revival itself reflects the insufficiency of the other approaches, such as the consequentialist or the deontological approaches. And again, so it's more about developing, inculcating virtue in humans. So for instance, we have been talking about designers, right? And human designers cannot work like robots, where you just sort of indoctrinate them, sort of inject those values into them. And they need to exercise wisdom. They need to exercise discretion while thinking of, what they are creating, why they are creating, what it will eventually be like, what eventually it will make the society like, etc., etc. So that is why, again, talking about virtue has become fashionable again. So virtuous human societies do not just need efficient, unbiased court trials, the example that I gave, right? That it's not only because again, we lose all those opportunities that allows us to think and become virtuous and to transcend the temptations of our lower selves. So virtuous human societies, more than anything else, need human beings in conscious pursuit of and exhibiting higher moral ideals. अभी मेरा self driven cars पे भी यही एतराज था कि हमारी कोई भी चीज़ है ना, अगर ethical कब बनती है, जब हम consciously करते हैं उसको, right? If we just do it unknowingly, right? यानी कि unknowingly I prevented an accident, right? Then that's not something that I would get the reward for, right? Or whereas knowingly, consciously, if we intend to do a sin and then restrain ourselves from doing that, then that becomes virtue, right? So again, how conscious we are, because again, when we sort of depute these things to the machines that do it on our behalf, they might lack that, of course, the human error and the human limitations, but I don't think, because they have their own limitations, right? So again, when we are talking about the environment, no one's talking about, the lifespan of these machines and how often we need to replace them, right? And then the environmental cost of maintenance, et cetera, right? So again, even during Dr. Ildis's talk, I was thinking that it was taken as a given that they are error-free, and we weren't questioning that. So again, that also needs to be done. So the making of virtuous individuals whose righteous actions, amal salihah practices, are central to the ethical formation of all institutions, including the technological. So this is also something that we have come across again and again during the course of our research, that what everyone is sort of having a consensus over is precisely that we want to have those institutions, right? Those institutions mein kaun kaam karte? Insaan kaam karte, right? They're human beings, they're individuals. And if they have not gone through that sort of a training, unko ek monolithic kism ki training de di gayi where they are more of technicians, then how can we expect the institutions? Because institution is not, a self-existing entity, right? It's made of individuals, right? And it's primarily, even if you look at the manhaj, the methodology, in Islam, it works on individuals, because no matter how wonderful policies you have at the top, right, unless the individuals who are making those everyday policies, that's central to this idea. This one last thing, and I've actually referred to it earlier, that there are people outside of faith traditions who are talking about techno-moral virtues and techno-moral wisdom. And we did talk about hikma in the Islamic context. So the root of this is Halak's comment, the root of this anticipated consensus in the spiritual ontological makeup of human fitra, the effects of which are still visible in the post-modern milieu, whether as New Age religion or return of the irrational, or humanist rendering of former religions, or the return of the religious. That again, fitra sort of is predominating no matter what. And we have to bank on that, right? Because we often feel that ye narrative kaun sunega, itna, purana thaka sa narrative, no one, but actually all those other things are pointing towards the fact that people, no matter in the form of New Age religion or whatever, there's this dearth, they're looking out for some deeper answers to those questions, and then finally what kind of human subjects you would want to make, who are able to exercise enhanced moral practical reasoning, so the virtues inform their moral decisions in the capacity of designers and users of technology. And that's a long-term solution, and that's why it doesn't sound that appealing, but nevertheless that's the solution. I mean, not the solution, but at least something that we need to work towards.